Good morning. Still looking awake, at least yesterday. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Quentin Bammey.
Bammey, yeah.
Who is joining us from Paris. He's going to give a talk about detecting image forgeries and deepfakes with positional encoding. So Quentin is also interviewing for a postdoc position, and so this is kind of like a double presentation. Go ahead.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. So, first of all, I want to thank Sabine for the invitation to talk, and Martin as well for organizing all this day. So, my name is Quentin Bammey. I did a PhD and I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Centre Borelli in the École Normale Supérieure Paris-Saclay in the Paris suburbs. Most of my research work focuses on image forensics, so detecting forgeries in images as well as satellite images, deepfakes, and more recently generated images. I've also worked in detection theory, so how to make detections of anomaly rather than just classifying objects, as well as image and video restoration. I'm quite into reproducible research, so how to make your research reproducible, write demos, and make it easy for people to reproduce your work. So I'd be happy to talk to you about that later. It's not the subject of my talk, of course. And I'm also working on an interactive teaching platform to make artificial intelligence easier of access for non-specialist students. So again, if you want more details, I'd be happy at some point to show you some demos, only in French, unfortunately. So my talk today is about a few subjects of image forensics on which I have been working recently or not so recently. So as you probably know, there are a lot of generated images now. Before that, you could also just manipulate them, for instance, with Photoshop. It's really great, for instance, if you want to do arts or marketing. It's great for a lot of applications, but it also paves the way for malicious users who want to spread disinformation or publicly humiliate or defamate people, to commit fraud as well, and for cybercrimes. So there is a lot of interest, not just to generate these images or modify them, but also to detect that an image is no longer pristine, that it no longer represents the real truth. How to do it? So in the first part of this talk, I am going to focus on image manipulations. So especially in one specific way of manipulation, which was the subject of my thesis. So most of our work in our lab was to focus on the image processing pipeline to reverse engineer it. So as you know, there are a lot of different steps in the processing pipeline. Oh, I have those right. So a lot of different steps. This is, of course, just a simplification of one possible pipeline. And one thing you can notice here is the noise curve of the image. So basically, the noise curve represents the noise level depending on the intensity of the image for each color channel. So as you can see on a raw image, the standard deviation of the noise is more or less linear compared to the luminance of each pixel. So this means that in more luminous areas, there will be more noise. In darker areas, there will be slightly less noise. But after each step of processing, the noise curve changes a lot. This is one of the traces that show that each one of these steps leaves traces on the image, which act as a signature of the image. So if we reverse engineer one or all of these steps, we can find a signature of the image, which helps us know how the image was processed, but also if you find that a region of an image shows a different signature, it can be a proof that the image is actually not authentic. So in this talk, I'm going to talk to you about one specific step here, which is demosaicing. So I think most of you are already quite familiar with demosaicing, so I just explain it very briefly. So cameras sample only one color per pixel on a fixed pattern, so they cannot see true color. There's a filter, a color filter in front of each pixel. So if you zoom in, it will look a bit like this. So half of the pixels, so you cannot see it very well because the image is actually quite interpolated here, but half of the pixels are sampled in green, 1/4 in red, and 1/4 in blue. This is the color filter array known as the Bayer pattern, which is used for most cameras. So you only know one of the colors for each pixel, and the camera needs to interpolate the missing colors. So this is a mosaic of an image. So basically, it's a representation that shows in which color each pixel was sampled. So here, each block represents one specific pixel. So of course, this is quite zoomed in, just a small crop of the image. And what I want to detect is in which color was a specific pixel sampled. So basically, this representation of the image is not known. You do not know when you have your PNG or JPEG image in which color each pixel was sampled. I want to know it. Why? Because let's say I take this part of the image, copy it and paste it here. So this is a very common kind of forgery known as copy move. Then the pattern that was here will be reproduced here. And except in 1 out of 4 unlucky cases, the pattern will no longer be correct. The same goes if you apply different kinds of processing, the mosaic will just be locally absent. So if you are able to know in which color each pixel was sampled, then you have a good chance at finding different kinds of forgeries. So there are a lot of different algorithms to demosaic an image. And as I showed in a small experiment here, if you take an image and demosaic it with another algorithm, or let's start with the same algorithm, you can do it in the 4 possible patterns. So the pattern is identified by the pixel on the color on the top left, for instance. So you have 4 possible patterns. You demosaic it on the 4 patterns. If you used the correct pattern, the one that was originally used, then you should find the same result if it's the same algorithm. If it's not the same algorithm, then the result will be slightly different, but still you should have more information on the correct pattern. So you should still have an image that is closer to the original image than the other patterns. As I've experienced it, it's actually quite often not the case because the different demosaicing algorithms are extremely different. This algorithm, bilinear, for instance, just take a local average of the color you're missing. Here are a lot of quite simple algorithms to demosaic. It can become very complicated. For instance, the 3 residual interpolation algorithms are actually handcrafted algorithms that take several minutes on one image and basically iterate over the demosaicing of one image to get the best result. And then more recently, there are also neural networks that either demosaic an image or even jointly demosaic and denoise it. So as you can guess, these algorithms are quite different. And it means that the approaches that try to mathematically model demosaicing to reverse engineer it are quite unfortunately doomed to fail, just due to the sheer variety of algorithms and due to JPEG compression. So here is a pristine image. If you compress it, it's a bit extreme here because we're showing it on the screen, but as you can see, the image is quite destroyed in the high frequencies. And the high frequencies are exactly where demosaicing artifacts are located. So with compression, it's even harder to detect demosaicing traces. So how to do it? For this, I introduced the notion of positional learning, so which I decided to call Polar. Basically, you train, so I will be speaking in a very generic manner, and I will be going into more practical detail just after. Basically, you train a model, any model, to take as input the neighborhood around the pixel or around another sample in a different signal if you want. It does not have to be images, actually. So the model only has access to the values around the neighborhood of the pixel. It does not have access to the position of the pixel. So what you do is you train the model to find positional information on that pixel. So basically, you have a function of the position. So it can be, for instance, find me the position modulo 2 of the pixel. And you train the network or the model to estimate that function. So usually it's because you cannot guess the full position, just small information out of it. So because the model does not know the position, it needs to infer it from structures and patterns that are present in the image and that can lead to the positional information required. Which means when you are at inference, if your network gives the correct output, it means that the structures on which it learned to detect the positional information are actually present in the image on which you are testing. If there are errors in the model's output, it can tell you about anomalies in the input, or it can tell you that the structures are not present at all in the image. So of course, this can be explained much more simply with a convolutional network, because here you don't have to worry about using a neighborhood of the pixel. This is what new convolutional networks will naturally do. So basically, you train a CNN, fully convolutional one, no pooling, no downsampling, no upsampling, to estimate a positional function on each pixel of the image. So for mosaic analysis, what I need is a modulo 2 position of each pixel. Because basically, so I do it in both directions, so the modulo 2 position horizontally and vertically. If I have those two information, it means, I have to show it here. It means I know the color on which each pixel was sampled. It also means the network, to learn this information, to be able to know the modulo 2 position of each pixel, the network actually has to rely on demosaicing traces to find these positions. If there are no demosaicing, the network will not find anything. So you train it only on real images. At this point, you don't even need fake images. You train it to detect the modulo 2 position on each pixel. And to do this, the network will learn to analyze the demosaicing artifacts. So this is a kind of self-supervised training. You don't need to know anything that you don't already have just in the image. Ideally, you need to know in which patterns the original image was demosaiced. Even if you don't know, it's not a big problem. After just a few rounds of training, you just have to choose the best of the four and it will globally be quite correct. And in any case, this is an information you usually have when you start with raw images, which is quite perfect to try a lot of algorithms in training. So it can seem quite useless at first because basically I'm training a network to detect the modulo 2 position of each pixel. I don't need to know the modulo 2 position of each pixel, I know it. But if you use it at inference, so here on top, it's a mosaic of an authentic image. If I use a network on this image, the network will find the modulo 2 position of each pixel, and it will give me the correct result in all or less ideally most of the pixels. So I'm not learning anything from the output because I already knew the pixel's position, but I know I'm learning one thing, which is that the network managed to find this position, which is a proof that the mosaic traces were consistent across the image. Reversely, if I use it at inference on a fake image, for instance, this one where the mosaic is locally defaced, so shifted by 1 pixel, here you will see in the red square, the network is actually wrong. It will not give the correct estimation here. And by looking at the network's result, not to know the position of the pixels, but to know where the network is wrong, I can actually see that there is a forgery. So for instance, here is a forged image with a church which is actually fake. If you look at the grid estimates, so this is basically the modulo 2 position of each pixel detected by the network and shifted back to depending on its real position, because you cannot see on the screen an image where our pixel shift every pixel. You can see that some regions here are quite erroneous. So we could think, great, I've detected the forgery. It's this region. But as you can also see, there are a lot of areas where the network is just wrong, especially between what I used were pink and gray. There are a lot of hesitations between pink and gray. So this can be explained quite simply because, as you can see, there are 4 possible patterns, but there are pairs of patterns that share the same green values, but not the same red and blue. So they are more difficult to distinguish. In any case, you can see there are erroneous regions and one which is more erroneous, which is actually the real forgery. So how to detect this forgery? I could just show a heat map where I show the percentage of wrong pixels, but it's actually not very helpful because you just know where an image is most likely forged. You're not answering the question, is this image forged? If someone uses this image in a trial, for instance, can I tell the jury, I'm confident it's not an authentic image? No. It's the same as if you are just training a network to distinguish real and fake images. You don't know what's happening inside the network. You're never sure about the result. So errors can be due, of course, to the forgery, but also to simple imprecisions in the network, especially for such a difficult task of detecting these very subtle artifacts. So one way to do this is what we call a contrario analysis. So to put it simply, overall in your image, let's say you have a probability P0 of the output being wrong. So it can be estimated, for instance, in the image, just as a ratio of wrong images, or you could estimate it globally, knowing that for this kind of images with this compression, you will have this ratio of errors. If you take one rectangle in the image, let's say that out of the n pixels, k are detected incorrectly by the network. Is the image forged? So if less than half the pixels are incorrectly detected, you say that most pixels are actually well detected. So you're not detecting a forgery, actually you're detecting the correct grid. Now, if k is below, if the ratio of errors in this rectangle is below the global ratio of errors, then the network may not be very correct, but there are still fewer errors than the average of the image. So it's probably just due to the network being wrong. So here, it's if it's larger than np0, not lower, there it means the ratio of errors is higher in this rectangle than in the rest of the image. So errors seem to be more concentrated in this area than globally. But it still does not mean there is a forgery, because if it's an average, there will be regions where it is higher naturally. So how to know if this is significant? So let's take a background hypothesis, which would be that the errors should be distributed quite evenly around the image. in a given rectangle, you have k out of the n pixels that are not correctly detected. So you have a background hypothesis. Under this background hypothesis, you can actually derive the probability to have at least those k pixels incorrectly detected. So k or more of the n pixels incorrectly detecting. The probability of this happening is simply here the tail of a binomial law, so very easy to compute. So if you threshold on this probability, you limit the weight of false detections per rectangle you test or you can test. So it's already better because you can give some confidence. So this is basically a p-value. You can give some confidence on your detection. But then you can test a lot of different rectangles. So to reach what we call the number of false alarms, you simply multiply this value by the number of tests you will do in the image. So the number of tests here would be the number of rectangles you test, or that you can, in theory, test, even if you don't test them all because you only test the significant ones. And if you threshold on this value, it's very practical because the threshold basically determines the maximum tolerated weight of false positives. So if you threshold at 1 out of 1,000, it means that you can tolerate one false positive every 1,000 images. So of course, this is under a background hypothesis. Sometimes it can be a bit off, but quite globally, it gives you a way to limit the number of false positives. And this theory, here I'm showing it for forensics, it actually works for a lot of detection tasks. So in my lab, we've used it for line segment detection, anomaly detection in many industrial settings as well. So it's not limited to forensics. So the assumption about the background hypothesis I made requires the pixels, the output of the networks on the pixels to be independent. So I'm using a neural network. The outputs are not really independent because they will use neighborhoods. So the solution here is actually to divide the number of correctly and incorrectly and total tested pixels by the aperture of the neural network. So squared because I'm looking at both directions. This actually simulates picking pixels on a lattice. So as if I downsampled the results to make sure each pixel were really independent. So in practice, this is a binomial law. You cannot use binomial laws with float values, but you can actually interpolate the binomial law with a special function that is called the incomplete regularized beta function. So I won't go into the mathematical details of why you can do it, but basically just know that you can interpolate the binomial law to work on floating values, which gives you the final test you can do to threshold and get a kind of guarantee on the number of false positives. Now, another problem we have is JPEG compression. If you compress your images, then the images have traces of demosaicing. They also have traces of JPEG compression. JPEG compression leaves traces in the form of blocking artifacts, 8x8 blocking artifacts. Now we have a big problem because if I want to be robust to JPEG compression, I want to train my network on compressed images. But if I do this, there's nothing to guarantee that the network will actually pick on the demosaicing artifact and will not just learn to see the JPEG compression artifacts, which are much more visible, much easier to use. How to prevent this? So in this case, we have a way to prevent it, which is instead of training it on one demosaiced and compressed image, I compress the image 4 times, so 4 different instances, compressed at a different phase compared to the demosaicing grid, which means that if the network uses the compression artifact to correctly detect the position here, it will actually be incorrect in the other 3 grids. So it basically forces it to learn to use the demosaicing artifacts. This is not all. If you do this, you can get decent results, but it's not enough for compressed images because, trust me, JPEG compression really destroys demosaicing artifacts. So even at high levels of compression, even with all this training, it's still not enough. So how to do it? I had a crazy idea one day, which was what if we have an image which might or might not be forged? Let's assume it's authentic. Let's train our network on the image to detect the modulo 2 position of the pixels on the image as if it was authentic. So at first, the error map is quite random. You cannot see a lot. So here you can already see it a bit, but not very significantly. But then if you keep training the network, you will actually see the forgery. Why? Well, I'd be happy to discuss it in details later on. There are a lot of reasons for which this works. Just understand the basic one, which is that if the network learns to detect the correct position in this area, it's basically the inverse signal to detecting the correct position in the other authentic, larger area. So there is a strong incentive for the network at first to accept to be incorrect here, just so that it can be correct at the other locations. Of course, if you train it for too long, you will have a big overfitting. You're training a network on one single image. So, and this is one of the remaining questions to answer in this work, which is when to stop learning. For now, I'm just trying on a lot of iterations and doing the detection on each of these. So to conclude on this part, there's still a lot to do, of course. There's a lot of efficiency to improve. I have to, if I want to be robust to JPEG compression images, I have to retrain my network on every single image I want to use. Also, to use positional learning, you cannot have any downsampling or upsampling layers in your network. It means that the network takes a lot of memory. And then the images need to be at full resolution because otherwise there are no artifacts. So this is a huge task. If you want to use it on reasonably sized images, be ready to spend 15 minutes per image. So it's not a big problem because when you analyze high quality images, it usually means it's not a social media setup, you have time. So potential interested people are, for instance, the French scientific police with whom we work, they have time to analyze images, but still it's not practical. But still, at least on uncompressed or low compressed images, so by that I mean high quality, above JPEG quality 95, so very high quality actually, you can get some really cool detection and you can actually visualize the detection. You know why you detect something. So now I'd like to move on to the second part of this talk, which will be slightly shorter, which is how to use positional learning to detect AI-generated images. So maybe you'd like to ask questions before that?
Any questions now?
Yeah. I have one question. What if like police starts using the algorithm and people will be aware that police is using this algorithm?
Yeah.
Then they might just be more careful into the copy pasting things and always do copy pasting with the correct modulo 2. So is it a kind of adversarial attacks against your defense?
So excellent question. So yes, if someone is careful, it's actually quite easy to escape this kind of detection. But actually we don't mind because for starters, most people who do forgeries are not that careful. They don't know much about image processing at all. Then there's also the fact that I'm looking at demosaicing, but so I won't go back all the way down, but there were a lot of steps in the processing pipeline. It's easy to evade one step to make it look correct. But now how do you evade our steps. So if you try to evade one step, you actually risk creating inconsistencies in other steps of the pipeline. So it's actually not that easy to completely fool our steps. So I won't say publicly how you can do it, of course. It's not impossible, unfortunately. But yeah, the thing is, for someone motivated, competent enough, unfortunately, it will be very difficult to make a detection, no matter the method you use, actually.
Actually, like the pipeline are one camera dependent.
Yeah.
Or like the way your model can adapt to different image processing pipelines, different mosaicing algorithms.
So from what I've tested, you have to train on different demosaicing algorithms specifically, but it actually generalizes quite well, which was the main pitfall of most pre-existing mathematical model-based methods before that. Because if you train on a few demosaicing algorithms, the network will pick the information which actually is true with most algorithms. So of course, there's always a risk of something being entirely different. But from what I've seen, it's no longer much of a problem. So we've tested it on images of which we did not know anything. So from completely different databases, we still got good results, which was not the case with methods we tried earlier. Actually, we had one method. If you applied some kind of adversarial median filtering on the image, so you just replace each pixel by the median of its neighborhood, it actually inverts most of its detections. So here we don't have so much of this problem. At least it's far from being as much of a problem for us as JPEG compression now.
So exactly about JPEG compression. Have you tried JPEG deblocking before running your algorithm?
So unfortunately, we had a small try with that. It appears that deblocking also removes the high frequency, so it actually makes it worse for us. It's better because the network can no longer use the compression artifacts, but it actually can no longer use demosaicing artifacts either. Unfortunately, demosaicing artifacts are very subtle for this, so it's actually quite hard to evade JPEG compression.
But like every image restoration neural networks, if you apply them on your final image, then it removes high frequencies and like demosaicing isn't detected.
It's a high risk. It's also a high risk with modern smartphones because if you take a photo with your smartphone now, chances are, if it's recent enough, it will not just take one picture, it will take a burst of pictures and merge them. So then at first, you don't have any mosaic artifacts. So I did this work for my thesis, which I defended 3 years ago. We didn't have these issues at the time. Also for the color filter array, at first there were almost only Bayer cameras. Now we're seeing different patterns coming up. So it's not a huge problem. You can retrain the network on different patterns, but it makes it more and more difficult to use this kind of analysis, unfortunately. As well, yes. The concept stays the same, especially with modern patterns. So most of the modern patterns we actually translate to a Bayer camera, just with a slightly different sampling process. Some are quite different, but the thing is, especially in smartphones, most demosaicing algorithms nowadays are neural network-based. Only real cameras still use algorithms simply to avoid needing a large battery. So yeah, unfortunately, the future of forgery detection, not just with demosaicing artifacts actually, but with many methods, is made harder as the restoration tasks remove more and more artifacts. So let's move on and we can back at the end if you need. So now, about when I defended my thesis actually and finished most of this work, we had a new problem, which many people call a breakthrough. Of course, it was one, but for us, it's actually also a big issue. Generated images. So at first, it was very difficult to generate images. You had to use GANs. The images were not realistic at all. Then about 2 years ago, you had stable diffusion and the series of diffusion models that followed. At first, we said, well, it's not easy to detect, maybe, but people have 6 fingers. People have asymmetric eyes. Less and less, the images are more and more correct. So to detect those, you can't any longer just use semantic artifacts. It's still being done, of course, especially the perspective of the scene is not always correct. The shadows are not always correct, but you cannot fully rely on that. So instead, what we're doing is to rely on spectral artifacts in the images. And this is actually quite unexpected application of positional learning. Very unexpected because this kind of problems did not exist at all when it was discovered. So let's take a generated and a real image, for instance, those two. So we apply what we call the cross difference to the images. So it's a very simple high pass processing filter. So very simple, just a high pass filter. And we look at the Fourier transform of these filtered images. What you can see quite clearly, not so clearly on most images, this one is really good. You can see peaks that correspond actually to components of periodicities 2, 4, and 8. And actually in Firefly, you can, not with just one image, but if you average a lot of images, you will also detect periodicities of 16. So look at the image. We apply our high pass filter. Let's zoom as much as we can on it. Okay, I think it's the last zoom level here. So I don't know where you can see it here, but there are grid artifacts. 8 by 8 grids are present on the image. Usually it's far from being that visible. So what we did was we took 1,000 images generated by different diffusion models, and we did this, averaged the Fourier transforms, well, not the Fourier transforms, averaged the high-pass filtered images, and computed the Fourier transform of the average. And in our models, you can actually see a signature of the model in the spectral domain. So I go briefly as to the why. Let's take latent diffusion, for instance, which is at the base of most diffusion models, at least those for which we know how it's done. So the image is encoded into a latent space. The diffusion process happens to generate the image in the latent space. So we're not looking at it at all. We're just looking here at the decoding. So here you have a small image with many channels, but small. And the decoder, we make it into a large 3-channel image. So basically, not just that, but the main steps at which we are looking is super resolution. Let's take a very basic one. You have a ×2 upsampling, convolution, and activation. And we look at it in the Fourier domain. If you just upsample, so forget the convolution and the activation for now, just upsample your image by a factor 2. In the Fourier domains, it means that you will take your original Fourier spectrum, you will periodize it. So if your image has size n, the Fourier value at peaks at sample n will actually be the value at sample 0. So the DC component, the continuous component, which is very high. And this is actually the location of the 2 periodic peak. So this value is very high. And then you have to multiply it, of course, by the spectrum of the upsampling filter. And for all upsampling filters, actually, this value at the position of this peak is actually 0. So this is high. This looks like this, and it's 0. So if you multiply the two, something as high as you want multiplied by 0 is still 0. So you actually don't see a peak. You see 0 values here. So what happens is that if after that you use convolutions, you use activations, what happens? If you use a convolution on this signal, a convolution is just a multiplication pixel-wise in the Fourier domain. So here it will remain a 0. If you use an activation, so an activation is like a value, so it's applied pixel-wise. If it's applied pixel-wise, it's actually the same as if you applied it after the upsampling. So it's actually, it's actually the same as if you did it before the upsampling. And if you did it before the upsampling, no matter the original signal, you will get a 0. But the magic of it is, if you do both a convolution then an activation, provided the convolution is not too specific, so of course there will be some convolutions for which it won't work, actually the convolution will mix the signals just enough that the activation will actually create peaks instead of zeros. But what matters for us, be it a peak or a 0, is that there is a specific trace at periodicity 2 after 1 times 2 super resolution. In most models, such as latent diffusion, the super resolution is done 3 times. So the 2 periodic filter, the 2 periodic peak after the first operation becomes 4 periodic, and then 8 periodic. And what's very good for us is that latent diffusion actually uses nearest neighbor upsampling. So we don't know why, because it's actually quite a bad upsampler. They probably consider that the convolutions will erase the issues, but we can see them quite well. So good for us. So hence are those signals, are those signatures and these spectrums. So how to detect them? So a first naive method is actually to just take the locations of the peaks and apply a very simple classifier to say whether it's real or fake. It's very simple. It actually works decently well, even when you have compressed images. So of course, it does not work all the time. It's too simple, but we're already quite surprised to see it works decently well, even on compressed images, where those peaks are so present just because of the compression. So it can actually distinguish both. Then we did a more complex method that looks at the whole spectrum and basically detects the regions in the spectrum that can be used to distinguish real and fake images. So I really like this method. It's mainly the work of Jan Haoli, one of my PhD students. I really like it also because it gives really pretty visualization. The signatures we have here now becomes more like this, because you extract the signature, but also the mask on the regions on which you have to look. So it's actually quite beautiful, I think. And then you have positional learning. So back at it. What to do with positional learning? Well, on most diffusion-generated images, you have 8 periodic peaks in the FFT spectrum. So let's train on your network to detect the modulo 8 position of each pixel. Well, it's quite similar as to demosaicing earlier. You train it just on synthetic images. You don't need to learn what a real image is for this. And the network will learn to rely on synthetic artifacts, so diffusion, so the super resolution artifacts I mentioned earlier, and it will be able to find the modulo 8 position of each pixel. If you use it, so at inference on a real image though, there's no artifacts. The neural network has nothing to use. So its result will be random-like. So if you zoom in a lot, you can still see some structure, which is due to the dependency between pixels, but you can very easily erase it if you look at a more global scale. So if my network gives the correct result, it's actually not saying me, it's actually not saying this image is synthetic. It's saying to me, I have the proof this image is synthetic. So this is why this method is quite useful here, because you not only say that the image is synthetic, the network actually brings the proof of it. And to verify the proof, you just have to look at whether the detection is correct. So one issue we did not have before. And I'd like to talk very briefly about it because I think it applies to a lot of problems. How to detect with a network the modulo 8 position of a pixel. And it's a problem that happens a lot in angle estimation. So if you want to estimate gate or rotated bounding boxes, how do you estimate with a network a modulo 8 position, an angle, something that is modular? So if you directly estimate it with a regression, for instance, then you have a big boundary issue because 0 and 2 pi will actually be detected as different values. So if your target is this, but you estimate this, the gradient will cause your network to get this value closer to this way. So it's good, you get closer to the angle. But here now, if your estimated angle is slightly negative, or slightly or very close to 2 pi, it's the same, and your target is slightly above 0, you'd actually like to just cross the boundary and go there. But if you use a direct estimation, the network will actually want to go all the way around. So you will be having a hard time estimating your value. So it's quite difficult to do. I'm not going to talk about the many different ways to do it because it will take some time. I'm happy to discuss this later on if you want. But basically, what we decided to do, it has drawbacks, of course, but it still works quite well, is to estimate the sine and cosine of the angle. So now we have values between 0 and 1, or -1 and 1, which actually means something, which we can estimate. So it's not perfect yet because we are actually estimated values in a square where we should be estimating them within a unit circle, if you look at it on the complex plane. So we are looking at solutions to mitigate this. For now, it's this. So now you're doing it. What next? This is an authentic image. This is a synthetic one. Here are the detection of the network on one 8x8 block in both images. So here, can you see something different between the two? Sorry?
So that is more spread.
Exactly. The white is more spread because you estimate a sine and a cosine. You estimate values between -1 and 1. If your network is not confident at all, then to minimize an MSE loss, for instance, it will be closer to 0, naturally. So already you can say that the value, the magnitude of the value, so the squared estimated sine plus the squared estimated cosine represents some kind of confidence of the network. Anything else? If I tell you the color represents the actual position of the pixel. Exactly. So it's not very easy to see, of course, because it's not a perfect detection. You have some kinds of clusters, but a lot of errors. So let's show it. Let's phase again each of the detection by its actual position. Now it's much easier to see. So on the authentic image, you don't see anything. The network is unable to detect anything. So even if you do this, it remains spread around the full circle or the unit square, strangely. But here on the authentic image, except for one error, you get it clustered nicely around one angle. So let's take the circular mean of the n-circular variance of all those points. So basically you take the average point in the complex plane. Here on the synthetic image, it's quite close to 1, which means that the values are nicely clustered together and we get one specific angle. On the authentic image, the values are spread out. So if you take an average, it will be close to 0. So you do it on all 8x8 blocks, and you will actually be able to see whether the network detected something or not. So whether there are diffusion artifacts. So again, you can use some a contrario analysis to make an automatic detection. So it's the same principle as before, so I will skip over it for now. So I think there are quite a lot of interesting advantages for positional learning for this kind of detections. First, contrary to other methods, we only need synthetic images for training. So at least we know we have no bias on what a real image is. And you can integrate compression robustness into the method as we did for demosaicing analysis. Overall, I think it enables us to leverage the power of a neural network, but still keep it focused on a specific task. But we have a few problems. So first of all, sometimes it's quite hard to make the detection, especially for some models. And a big problem, I showed you earlier with demosaicing, how to force the network to be robust to compression by creating the compression dephased depending on the pixel. But for some commercial models, such as Firefly or DALL-E 3, you cannot do this actually, because when you generate and download these images, they are actually already compressed. And they don't tell you this, they give you PNG images. But actually, if you analyze the images, for DALL-E, you can see traces of WebP compression, which leaves the same blocking artifacts as JPEG. And for Firefly, traces of JPEG compression. So how to be sure you do not detect the JPEG compression? I was lucky with Firefly. I was able to generate and download 1,000 images at JPEG quality 95, because now the JPEG quality is 70. Not very useful to generate good-looking images. By the way, it's already a very high compression. And another question, which is much more general, and it's not just for this method, but all of them, how to deal with real-life images. So in January, I went to Amsterdam with a consortium with whom I'm working on fight against disinformation. And we looked at this image. So you probably know it. It spread massively, a generated image of the Pope wearing a Balenciaga coat. And we looked at all instances of this image we could find across social media. And the thing is, the longer time is spent after the first publication, the more the image is edited. The more it is edited, we compressed, we sampled again, the harder it is to detect. To the point that the only solution we had to detect the last images was actually to use some registration to link the last image back to the first one, which was published. So in this case, it was actually made even harder for the Pope, because the second publication of this image, actually, we sampled the image by removing 10 columns, so not removing, but we sampling by 10 pixels less in just one direction. And this is the image that was actually massively shared. So it was even harder to detect. So we tested it with a pop image. We tested it with several images generated and then diffused, pretending it was in Gaza at the height of the war. And we got the same results for all of them. So unfortunately, we don't have a good solution yet, except if you can find the original image. And I'm not sure there will be a solution, because at the end, there is a lot of changes that can happen. So some method can still look at the diffusion process itself, for instance, by inverting clip features to notice that some were used more frequently and more representatively of the clip version used. But for this, there's a high risk of semantic bias. So you cannot be certain, unfortunately. So I'm really sorry to end the talk on such a bad note, but I think the fight is far from finished, and unfortunately far from being won. So as future work as well, so I'm happy to talk about it later if you want. I think positional learning is not done yet. I don't think it has to be limited to forensics. And especially I used it to detect demosaicing. I used it to detect super resolution. Why not use it adversarially? So this is future work, of course, but if you want to create super resolution, for instance, you can use a positional learning train neural network to detect the super resolution artifacts. If you use it adversarially, you can maybe train it to be without artifacts. And I think this could be quite useful in cases you don't have a ground truth. So for instance, in satellite images, the ground truth is in other, so the ground truth at better resolutions is in other bands, so other spectrums, so it's different. It can, but it's harder to be used. And you cannot do like with natural images where you downsample them manually and try to recreate the super resolution. Because here you don't have any multi-scale hypothesis with satellite images. So it's much harder to do. The same goes if you have upsampling layers in your networks, such as, say, a unit. You don't have a ground truth because it's not really images with which you're working. So this could also be used to improve the super resolution modules within your networks. So just future works, of course, but some ideas if you want to discuss later on. So, oh, and to finish, so I've already said this. I'd like to talk very briefly about one specific consortium with whom I'm working in my lab, which is Vera.ai. So the website is veraai.eu, not vera.ai, which is some kind of spam website. Unfortunately, we don't own it. And especially, we have a detection tool. So it integrates some of our methods to detect forgeries, to detect deepfakes, to analyze images for a lot of things. It's mainly for fact checkers, but it can be used by everyone. So if you are a researcher, you can also ask to get the pro account. Otherwise, the features are a bit limited. Also, sorry, it only works on Google Chrome. Sorry, I'm not the developer. So, well, thanks a lot, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Yes.
Let's talk. I have two questions about the second work. So the first is the assembly and convolutional activation layers goes on the patterns.
Yeah.
I understand the assembly layers will introduce some repeat patterns of the generated image, but why I'm still a little confused why the convolutional layer and activation layers are necessarily required.
So thank you. An excellent question. So there are two ways for which it's required. So it's required to do a nice super resolution, of course. So not for the detection and the peaks, but simply because if you use a simple super resolution layer, it will yield artifacts. Artifacts are not pretty to look at. So the convolution can be used to help remove some kinds of artifacts. Actually, some methods can even use more modern methods such as transformers. So it's a way to say, I don't want to bother creating a good upsampling algorithm because it's the area of neural networks after all. So I just use a very simple one, even nearest neighbor super resolution, well, upsampling. And then I let a very small, just few layers of neural network do the rest to make it prettier. So now as to why it's required to generate these peaks, this is because if you don't use it, if you only have a super resolution, so an upsampling, you will have this product in the final Fourier peak, which means that you multiply something very high with a 0 at the location of the peak. So it's still a 0. And this decreases much more quickly than this increases. So you still have a 0. But if you had a convolution, it will start mixing the pixels a little bit, but in a way that basically stays ordered for this pattern to remain. Because in a Fourier transform, if you convolute an image, you multiply the spectrum by the convolution spectrum. So you multiply this 0 by whatever you want. It's still 0. Then the activation, it's used in your networks because you cannot just add convolutions on top of convolutions on top of convolutions. Otherwise, it's still just one big convolution. So it is used, and it's useful to create the peak as well. Not that it is an intended effect of the super resolution, because the activation itself, it's important to understand, it's not enough either, because it's pixel by pixel. It could equivalently happen before the upsampling. It will be equivalent. Maybe not the same exact unsampling, still an upsampling, still the 0 problem. So still a 0 instead of a peak. But if you use both the convolution then the activation, then it's no longer equivalent, because you cannot put everything in the order, in any order you want then. And then it's enough to make it that the modifications of on the convolutions are no longer ordered, and it's enough to basically cancel this. So unfortunately, it's very difficult to model because the typical convolution, the typical activation is a ReLU. So basically an absolute value and a 0 part. It's something that can have very unpredictable effects on a Fourier spectrum. So we're trying to modelize it by using a square activation. So not something you see commonly, but something very useful to model. First, because a square of a signal is very easy to modelize in the Fourier spectrum. It's just a convolution in the Fourier pattern. And it actually helps understand why this peak is no longer here. Because if you have a convolution that looks at the left and the right, it's much higher. So it can be a peak now. And also because even the very not nice functions such as ReLU can be approximated with a square, with a polynomial. And from our experiments, for this, it can be modelized quite well with very few degrees. So it's still a work in progress, but we are able to modelize it better this way, and also understand what kind of convolutions are needed to create this peak. Because it's quite easy to see if you don't have a convolution that looks at the center, it's still officially a convolution, but it does not do anything. It will remain a 0. But if you don't look at all at the center and just at this and this, then it will actually be much higher.
Thank you. And second question, so the detector you relied on the patterns are specific to the architecture of the generated models, such as the or the layers. So how about the generalization of your?
Thank you. Excellent question. So indeed, our intuition is that the detection, the network will depend on the specific steps used, not in the full architecture, but just in the decoder. And this may explain why we still struggle to generalize with positional learning. So of course, I've shown it to you by starting with this. This is actually our most recent work. So we did not have the full model when we started working with positional learning. Now I'm trying to understand, to use this to improve positional learning for this, which could be done. And this is still future work, so I don't have a definitive answer, of course. But this could be done by working not on synthetic images, actually, but on signals, images, or even random noise, for which I create the super resolution. Because if I do this, I can basically use any kind of convolution, any kind of a set of combination of super resolution to hopefully get something general enough. With a caveat though, JPEG compression, yes, again, because actually we notice that JPEG compression can be modeled as downsampling, then times 8 super resolution. So it's not trivial at all, but you can actually make a model that simulates JPEG compression by upsampling from a downsampled image with more channels. And it's very bad for us because it might mean you have to stay around some kind of super resolutions we don't want to learn. Otherwise, we might be learning compression. And by the way, another caveat, I know a lot of people are working on improving images with diffusion models, denoising, restoration. If you do this, I might actually, with these models, detect the image as fake. And it can actually become a big problem in the long term, because if these models start to be lightweight and be integrated in standard pipelines, then how do we make a detection? Sorry to be even more gloomy than when I concluded the talk, though.
I have a question regarding in-painting. Did you try these detection method on in-painting? If you can still get these structures.
So excellent question. We don't have a definitive answers to that. We actually had an intern, we hired him to do this. In the meantime, we found an even more interesting problem. So we did not go this far and we stopped at other problems. But hopefully, this method can actually be used locally to find local traces of the in-painting if it's done with a diffusion model. The question remains, how much is the super resolution similar if you do this? And how much also will the rest of the image be affected? If all the image is encoded, so normally it's not the case, but if you have a model that takes the entire image and just changes part of it, but then does the decoding on everything, then it might be harder. In most cases, though, we hope to be able to detect just locally those traces, and it should lead us to this region. Of course, it's only for diffusion in painting. If you do in painting with more traditional means, probably we cannot see anything with this. And we shouldn't, because it's actually a different kind of forgeries.
But you would find it with your first one.
Possibly. If there were still traces of demosaicing, we would see them absent. And a lot of other methods which could actually work as well. Which is why actually I think it's utopic to have one network to detect all kinds of forgeries. And rather we need a lot of different methods targeting either different kinds of forgeries, different artifacts in the pipeline that you can see, for which you can see it is inconsistent. And sometimes not even network. For instance, if you want to detect internal copy moves, there are a lot of state-of-the-art neural networks to do this. None work as well as just detecting features on the image and doing some intelligent SIFT-like matching. You can use networks to detect the features, of course, but you cannot use it to simulate SIFT.
So just about that, you said you can have multiple models, but what about having multiple outputs and multi-task learning kind of?
So very good question. I actually had this talk a few days ago, just before the conference started. And so here it's really my opinion. I don't have any experiment or anything. But the thing is, if you have multiple outputs to the network and multiple inputs, then how are you certain that this output corresponds to this kind of forgeries? Or something that can be even more common, and we're starting to see papers on it. If you have one network, multiple branches of the network, and then one output that merges all the branches. So the branches are in a latent space, the network does the final part, does the rest of the job. Then how do you know why the network made the detection? So basically, it can work. Maybe it can even give better results, I don't know. But one thing that is certain, you will have much less explainability.
I think you already touched on JPEG compression a few times, but just to be clear, if you try to detect real images, it's with or without JPEG compression?
So you mean the experiment at the end?
They're not.
Here?
Like, for example, here, the real image has not gone through any compression.
No.
Okay.
If it has gone through compression, in most cases, we can prevent the network from detecting the artifacts because we train it specifically not to look at these artifacts.
But it will also have this eight periodicity.
Not so much. Fortunately, not so much. This is purely experimental. Now, I don't have a strong proof why it does not happen so much. It can actually still happen if you have a very strong compression, simply because let's just take an infinite compression that just transforms every block into a flat block, so just keep the DC component of each block. Then probably, no matter the network, actually, you would only get very similar outputs everywhere. Fortunately, it does not happen too much from what we've seen on realistic compressions. And honestly, if the compression is too high, I think the only correct answer to say, no matter where the image comes from, if the compression is too high, if the image has been downsampled too much, the only correct answer to give is there's nothing to see in this image in any case. And that's an extreme case, but some reviewers actually would like us to be robust to extreme downsampling or similar things. But the thing is, if you go to the extreme, you only have one pixel. Is the pixel authentic or forged? And well, I let you decide that. But yeah, the interactions between JPEG compression and our detections are infinitely complex to understand, unfortunately.
Good, thank you. I think in the interest of, well, you have to, you're going to meet the whole day. I think you can ask questions later. So Martin has a sign-up sheet. I think it's relatively full, but if you would like to meet with Quentin and you haven't signed up, let Martin know you're going to be around the whole day.
Yeah.
And so.
And I think there are still 2 slots for this afternoon.
Yeah, there's still 2 slots for this afternoon.
And feel free to join us for lunch in this afternoon. I think we're going to have lunch together, probably at 12 something.
Okay. Good.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction.